In April 1942, under the Makassar sun on Celebes, Lieutenant Richard Antrim watched 2,700 Allied prisoners form a circle while a Japanese guard raised a hawser over an unconscious naval officer's head. 15 blows had already landed. 3 soldiers kicked the body repeatedly. The officer would not survive the remaining strikes. Antrim knew the mathematics. 0 authority over the assembled Japanese force, 0 experience negotiating with enemy guards. Intervention in a military execution was a capital offense. The Japanese would behead any prisoner who questioned their authority. But Antrim had something most naval officers did not. 11 years of command on destroyers where leadership depended on reading men under extreme pressure, not manuals. He was about to use that civilian skill, peacetime diplomacy under fire, to execute 2 improvisations that would save 2,700 lives. If you want to see how a naval officer transformed peacetime leadership into wartime survival, please hit the like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Antrim. March 1st, 1942, Second Battle of the Java Sea. Coordinates 4 degrees 0 south S, 111 degrees 30 east-south. The USS Pope, Clemson-class destroyer DD-225, 314 feet of steel displacing 1,190 tons, escorted the damaged HMS Exeter through tropical waters when Japanese aircraft struck at 1100 hours. Antrim stood on the bridge as executive officer, second in command, under Lieutenant Commander Welford Charles Blinn. The destroyer maneuvered hard, turning to present a narrow profile to the bombers diving from 8,000 feet. Near misses bracketed the ship, then a direct hit amidships. The explosion tore through the engine room. Pope lost power at 11:47 hours, dead in the water. The Japanese circled for another pass. Blinn ordered abandon ship at 11:53. Pope sank at 12 hours in water 60 meters deep. Antrim went into the ocean with shrapnel wounds in his left side. He reached a lifeboat. 19 other men pulled themselves aboard. No water, no medical supplies. The tropical sun turned the boat into an oven. Antrim took command by voice alone, calm tone, measured words. He organized shifts for bailing water that seeped through the hull seams. He rationed the small quantity of emergency rations they found under the seats, 2 biscuits per man per day. He kept the men focused on tasks, on survival procedures, on anything except the sharks circling the boat or the Japanese destroyers passing in the distance. Official citation would later state Antrim's calm voice, effective leadership, and valiant example held them together. 3 days in that boat, 3 nights watching the stars wheel overhead. On March 5, 1942, a Japanese warship approached. The men prepared to die. Instead, the Japanese pulled them from the water. Prisoners. The Japanese transported the survivors to Makassar, Celebes. The prison camp occupied former Dutch infantry barracks on the outskirts of the city. Concrete buildings arranged in a square around a central parade ground, guard towers at each corner, a single gate facing east. The Japanese had been using the facility since February 1942 to concentrate captured Allied personnel from the Java Sea engagements. When Antrim arrived in mid-March, the camp held approximately 2,870 prisoners. The composition was specific. 1,100 Royal Netherlands East Indies Army personnel, mostly Indonesian troops with Dutch officers, and 1,700 Allied naval personnel, from multiple nationalities. British sailors from HMS Exeter, 652 men who survived when their cruiser went down on March 1st. Americans from USS Pope, Dutch sailors from destroyed cruisers, Australians from coastal defense vessels sunk during the Japanese invasion. The Japanese command structure treated naval prisoners differently than ground troops. Naval officers were considered technically skilled but physically weak. The Japanese believed men who operated ships could not perform manual labor. This belief would prove useful. The camp commandant, a Japanese Navy captain whose name never appeared in declassified documents, ran the facility with strict protocols. Morning formation at 0600 hours. Prisoners stood in ranks by nationality. Japanese guards conducted count. Any discrepancy resulted in the entire camp standing at attention until the error was identified. This could take hours. Food consisted of rice, occasional fish, sometimes vegetables. The caloric content averaged 1,400 per day, enough to prevent immediate starvation, not enough to maintain strength during forced labor. Antrim observed the camp systems during his first week. He identified the guards who responded to discipline and those who used violence arbitrarily. He noted which Japanese officers understood English and which pretended not to. He tracked the daily routines, the patrol patterns, the times when guard attention relaxed. This was reconnaissance. Naval officers called it situational awareness. The knowledge would matter. April 1942, specific day not recorded in available primary sources. A naval officer, identity withheld in official citations, stood accused of an infraction. The exact nature of the charge remains unclear in declassified documents. The Japanese assembled the entire guard force on the parade ground. They brought the accused officer to the center. The Japanese commander addressed the assembled prisoners in English. The officer had committed an offense against camp regulations. Punishment would be administered publicly. The entire camp would witness. This was standard Japanese procedure. Public punishment served as deterrence. The Japanese believed visible consequences maintained discipline. The 2,700 Allied prisoners formed a circle around the parade ground. Antrim stood in the front rank with other USS Pope survivors. He watched the Japanese commander gesture to 3 soldiers. They brought the accused officer forward. The commander produced a hawser, a braided rope used for securing ships to dock, approximately 2 inches in diameter, 4 feet long. The rope was designed to withstand tons of tension. Against human flesh, it would function as a devastating club. The commander handed the hawser to a guard. The guard was young, perhaps 20 years old, face flushed with heat and anger. The Japanese called this punishment shioki. The guard raised the hawser. The first blow struck the officer's shoulders. The man cried out. The second blow hit his back, the third across his legs. The officer tried to remain standing. At the 5th blow, he fell to his knees. At the 10th blow, he collapsed forward onto the packed dirt. The guard continued striking. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 blows total. The officer lay motionless. The 3 soldiers approached. They began kicking the body. Systematic kicks to the ribs, the abdomen, the head. The 2,700 prisoners watched in silence. No one moved. Movement would draw the guards' attention. Attention meant becoming the next target. Antrim made his decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He stepped forward, out of the prisoner ranks, broke formation, an executable offense by itself. The Japanese guards turned toward him, rifles came up. Antrim raised both hands, palms out, universal gesture of non-aggression. He walked slowly toward the guard holding the hawser. His voice was calm. He spoke in English. The guard understood basic English, most did. Antrim explained that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. Perhaps the charges could be discussed. Perhaps the punishment could be reconsidered. He used the same tone he had used on the lifeboat, measured and reasonable, the voice of a man solving a technical problem, not challenging authority. The guards stared at him. The entire Japanese force watched. The commander stepped forward. He studied Antrim. This was unexpected. Prisoners did not intervene. Prisoners did not speak during punishment. The commander spoke in Japanese to the guard. The guard responded, a brief exchange. Then the commander turned to Antrim and asked in English what unit he represented. Antrim identified himself. Executive Officer, USS Pope. The commander nodded. He had heard of Pope. The destroyer had fought well before sinking. The commander respected naval officers who fought well. Antrim proposed discussing the charges against the accused officer. The commander considered this. Discussion implied negotiation. The Japanese military did not negotiate with prisoners. But this was an unusual situation. The prisoner was showing courage, not defiance. There was a difference. The commander agreed to hear the officer's defense, but the punishment would continue. The officer had been condemned. The sentence would be carried out. Antrim nodded. He understood. Then he made his second offer. Allow him to take the remainder of the punishment. The 3 soldiers had stopped kicking. The accused officer lay unconscious, beaten beyond the point where he could survive additional blows. If the punishment was required, Antrim would substitute himself. This would fulfill the sentence while demonstrating mercy toward a defeated enemy. The Japanese commander's face showed confusion. This was unprecedented. In Japanese military culture, such an offer made no logical sense. The accused was guilty. The substitute was not. Punishment followed guilt. You did not punish the innocent. But this officer was volunteering. The commander turned to his officers. They spoke rapidly in Japanese. The 2,700 Allied prisoners remained motionless. The tension was physical. Everyone understood that Antrim had just gambled his life on reading the Japanese commander's character correctly. The guard, holding the hawser, looked to his commander for orders. The commander raised his hand. Stop. He addressed Antrim in English. The offer was noted. The courage was acknowledged. But the prisoner who volunteered to accept punishment for another was either insane or possessed extraordinary loyalty. The Japanese respected loyalty above all military virtues. The commander made his decision. The punishment was complete. The accused officer would receive medical attention. The volunteer would return to his unit. Both men would live. The guards walked away. 3 soldiers carried the unconscious officer to the camp medical station. Antrim returned to the prisoner ranks. A British officer standing beside him whispered that what just happened should have resulted in immediate execution. The Japanese should have beheaded Antrim the moment he stepped forward. But something in the offer, in the tone, in the demonstration of willingness to suffer for another man had penetrated the cultural barrier. The Japanese commander was not moved by sentiment. He was impressed by the tactical display of leadership. Antrim had demonstrated the quality the Japanese called yamato-damashii, the spirit of self-sacrifice. The commander recognized it even in an enemy. The immediate consequence was documented in post-war interviews, new respect for American officers and men, and a great improvement in camp living conditions. The Japanese guards became less arbitrary, not lenient, but more predictable. They followed regulations instead of inventing punishments. Food quality improved slightly. Medical supplies became available for serious cases. The change was marginal, but measurable. Men noticed. Morale improved. And Antrim became someone the Japanese watched constantly. His courage had bought survival for one man and better conditions for 2,700. But it also marked him. Any future act of defiance would not be forgiven twice. Spring 1942, approximately 3 weeks after the beating incident, the Japanese commander summoned Antrim to the camp administrative building. Antrim reported as ordered. The commander explained that American aircraft had been spotted over Makassar, B-24 Liberators conducting reconnaissance from Australian bases. The Japanese anticipated bombing raids. The camp required defensive preparations. Slit trenches would be constructed around the perimeter to provide protection from bomb fragments. Antrim would lead a labour detail to complete this work. The irony was not subtle. The Japanese wanted Allied prisoners to build fortifications that would protect those same prisoners from Allied bombs. Antrim was assigned 40 men from various nationalities. The Japanese provided shovels, picks, and bamboo stakes for marking trench locations. A Japanese engineer lieutenant gave Antrim a diagram showing the standard trench layout, parallel lines of slit trenches, each trench 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, 4 feet deep. The trenches would be positioned 15 feet apart in rows, covering the open ground between the prisoner barracks and the perimeter fence. The engineer lieutenant explained the geometry. The trenches must be oriented north-south to maximize coverage. The spacing must be exact to prevent gaps. Antrim studied the diagram and confirmed he understood. The engineer lieutenant assigned 2 guards to supervise. Work would begin immediately. The guards watched closely during the first day. They verified that Antrim's men dug to the correct depth. They measured spacing between trenches. They inspected the quality of the excavation. Sloppy work would be punished. But Antrim's men worked carefully. Most were naval personnel accustomed to following technical specifications. They dug straight walls. They maintained proper dimensions. They placed excavated dirt in neat piles beside each trench. The guards found no faults. After 3 days, the guards relaxed their supervision. They stood in shade, watching from a distance instead of inspecting each trench. This was predictable. The Japanese had determined that the work was proceeding correctly. Continued close supervision was unnecessary. Antrim waited until the 4th day before implementing his modification. He altered the spacing between certain trenches, not dramatically, just small adjustments. Instead of 15 feet between trenches, he placed some at 17 feet, others at 13 feet. He changed angles slightly. Where the diagram showed parallel lines, he introduced subtle curves. The changes were minor enough that guards watching from 30 yards away would not notice. But when viewed from above, from the altitude where a B-24 flew reconnaissance missions, the pattern would resolve into something specific. 2 letters, U and S. The technical challenge was significant. Antrim needed to create letters large enough to be visible from 8,000 feet, the typical altitude for photo reconnaissance. Based on standard aerial photography principles, that required each letter to be approximately 60 feet tall. The letter forms had to be simple, straight lines and curves that could be constructed using trench placement. The U was easier, a curved line of trenches. The S required more complexity, 2 curves connecting at a central inflection point. Antrim used trench spacing and orientation to create the curves. Where trenches were closer together, the pattern appeared darker from above. Where trenches spread apart, the pattern lightened. The contrast would show up on reconnaissance photographs. The risk was immediate death. If the Japanese engineer lieutenant inspected the layout and recognized the deviation from his diagram, if the guards noticed the pattern from ground level, if anyone asked why Antrim was modifying the approved design, the punishment would be execution. The Japanese had already demonstrated mercy once. They would not do so again. Antrim worked carefully. He maintained the appearance of following orders while implementing changes that served Allied intelligence. This was asymmetric warfare, a prisoner using the enemy's own defensive project to communicate with friendly forces. The work took 2 weeks. 40 men digging approximately 180 slit trenches in a specific pattern, covering an area 60 feet wide by 120 feet long. The Japanese engineer lieutenant conducted a final inspection on the last day. He walked through the trench field, examining the work. He measured depths. He checked spacing with a measuring tape at several locations. The spacing varied by a foot or two, which was acceptable given the manual nature of the excavation. He approved the work. The trenches were functional. They would provide adequate protection from bomb fragments. Antrim and his detail returned to regular camp routine. The Japanese considered the project complete. October 1943. The official record states B-24s bomb Makassar on Celebes Island. The bombers approached from the south, flying from Australian bases at Darwin and Catherine. The mission was part of the ongoing Allied campaign to interdict Japanese logistics in the Netherlands East Indies. The B-24s carried a mix of high explosive and incendiary bombs intended for the port facilities and fuel storage areas in Makassar city. Standard procedure required reconnaissance aircraft to fly ahead of the bomber formation and photograph the target area. The reconnaissance photos would be analyzed for bomb damage assessment and for identifying future targets. The reconnaissance photos from the October 1943 mission showed something unexpected in the prisoner camp outside Makassar. 2 large letters formed by what appeared to be a pattern of slit trenches, U and S. The pattern was artificial, intentional. Someone in that camp had used construction work to create a signal visible only from the air. The intelligence officers analyzing the photos understood immediately. This was a POW camp holding American personnel. The signal indicated the camp should not be bombed. The intelligence report was forwarded up the chain of command. The prisoner camp at Makassar was removed from the target list. Future bombing missions would avoid that location. The report noted that approximately 2,700 Allied prisoners were believed held at the facility based on estimates from survivors who had been transferred out in late 1942. The US signal confirmed American presence. The camp location was marked on all subsequent targeting maps as a restricted zone. No bombs would be dropped within 1,000 meters of that position. Antrim never knew if his signal was received. The camp had no way to monitor Allied bombing patterns. The prisoners knew raids occurred because they heard the explosions and saw smoke rising from the port, but they had no information about target selection. Antrim could only hope that somewhere someone saw the pattern and understood. The validation came after the war, when American intelligence officers reviewed the October 1943 reconnaissance photos and identified the US signal. Post-war interviews confirmed that Antrim had supervised the trench construction in spring 1942. The time frame matched, the methodology matched, the signal had accomplished its purpose. The camp population changed throughout 1942 and 1943. In October 1942, approximately 1,000 prisoners were transferred to Nagasaki on the transport ship Asymmetric. These were primarily sailors from HMS Exeter, HMS Encounter, HMS Stronghold, USS Pope, and USS Perch. They were designated for industrial labor in Japan. The men who departed included most of Antrim's fellow Pope survivors. Antrim remained in Makassar with the prisoners who were judged too ill for transport or needed to maintain camp operations. In June and July 1944, another 1,700 prisoners were moved to a new camp in a swampy coconut plantation south of Makassar. Conditions at the new camp were worse. More disease, less food, higher mortality rates. April 6, 1944. The Japanese executed Lieutenant Colonel A.L.A. Gortmans of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army along with 6 other prisoners. The charges were resistance, conspiracy, and espionage. The Japanese had discovered a radio hidden in the camp. The radio had been used to receive Allied broadcasts. This was a capital offence. The Japanese commander ordered a trial. The prisoners were found guilty. Execution by firing squad occurred at 0800 hours on the parade ground where Antrim had intervened 2 years earlier. All prisoners were required to watch. The message was clear. Resistance would be punished with death. No mercy would be shown. Antrim survived. He endured malaria, dysentery, tropical ulcers, and malnutrition. He watched men die from disease and execution. He watched the camp population decline from 2,870 to fewer than 800 by mid-1945. The Japanese reduced rations as their own supply situation deteriorated. The guards became more unpredictable. Discipline broke down. Men were beaten for minor infractions or for no reason at all. The camp became a place where survival depended on staying invisible, avoiding attention, and waiting for the war to end. September 24, 1945. Allied forces liberated the Makassar prison camp. Australian troops from the 9th Division arrived in trucks. They brought medical supplies, food, and transport. The prisoners were emaciated. Average weight loss was 40 to 50 pounds per man. Many could barely walk. Antrim weighed 132 pounds, down from 165 pounds when he was captured. But he was alive. The war was over. January 30, 1947, the White House, Washington, D.C. President Harry S. Truman presented the Medal of Honor to Commander Richard Antrim for actions taken in the Makassar prison camp. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while interned as a prisoner of war of the enemy Japanese in the city of Makassar, Celebes, Netherlands East Indies in April 1942. Acting instantly on behalf of a naval officer who was subjected to a vicious clubbing by a frenzied Japanese guard, venting his insane wrath upon the helpless prisoner, Commander Antrim boldly intervened, attempting to quiet the guard and finally persuading him to discuss the charges against the officer. With the entire Japanese force assembled and making extraordinary preparations for the threatened beating, and with the tension heightened by 2,700 Allied prisoners rapidly closing in, Commander Antrim courageously appealed to the fanatic enemy, risking his own life in a desperate effort to mitigate the punishment. When the other had been beaten unconscious by 15 blows of a hawser and was repeatedly kicked by 3 soldiers to a point beyond which he could not survive, Commander Antrim gallantly stepped forward and indicated to the perplexed guards that he would take the remainder of the punishment, throwing the Japanese completely off balance in their amazement and eliciting a roar of acclaim from the suddenly inspired Allied prisoners. President Truman added his own words after reading the citation. "You did more than that. You exemplified the greatest of all qualities, the willingness to give your own life for a fellow man." The president clasped Antrim's hand. Photographers captured the moment. The image appeared in newspapers nationwide, but the citation made no mention of the slit trenches or the US signal. That information remained classified. The full story would not emerge until intelligence files were declassified decades later. Antrim's post-war career followed the traditional Navy path. He was promoted to captain in 1948, rear admiral in 1952. He commanded cruisers and destroyer squadrons. He served at the Naval War College as an instructor in leadership and ethics. His classes focused on decision-making under pressure and the moral responsibilities of command. He never discussed his POW experience publicly during these years. When students asked about his Medal of Honor, he redirected the conversation to the tactical problems of the day. The war was finished. The lessons mattered more than the stories. Antrim retired from the Navy in 1954 at age 46 after 32 years of service. He settled in San Diego with his wife. He spent his retirement consulting for defense contractors on shipboard systems and naval tactics. He participated in veterans organizations, but rarely spoke at public events. When researchers contacted him in the 1960s requesting interviews about the Java Sea campaign, he declined. He believed the focus should be on the ships and the crews, not on individual officers. His generation did not seek attention. They had done their jobs. That was sufficient. The hidden message trick remained classified until 1968, when the first comprehensive history of Allied POWs in the Pacific was published. The book included a footnote mentioning that at least one camp had used ground signals to communicate with reconnaissance aircraft. The specific camp was not identified. But researchers who knew Antrim's history made the connection. A journalist contacted him in 1969 requesting confirmation. Antrim confirmed that he had supervised trench construction at Makassar. He confirmed that he had modified the layout to create a signal pattern. He declined to provide additional details. The matter was closed. On March 7, 1969, Rear Admiral Richard Antrim died of heart failure at the age of 61. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The Medal of Honor citation was read at the service. 300 people attended, including former crew members from USS Pope and survivors from Makassar. A British officer who had been imprisoned in the camp gave a brief eulogy. He spoke about the beating incident and how Antrim's intervention had changed the camp atmosphere. He spoke about leadership by example. He did not mention the trenches. That detail remained obscure. The full story emerged in 1987 when a researcher at the National Archives discovered the October 1943 reconnaissance photographs in a collection of declassified intelligence materials. The photos clearly showed the US pattern in the prison camp trenches. The researcher cross-referenced the photos with POW records and identified Antrim as the officer who had supervised the trench construction project. The researcher published an article in a military history journal documenting the connection. The article included the reconnaissance photos and interviews with surviving Makassar prisoners. The hidden message technique became part of Antrim's documented legacy. The significance extended beyond one camp or one officer. Antrim's actions demonstrated a principle that military planners had often overlooked. Prisoners were not helpless. Even under total enemy control, even without weapons or communications, even facing execution for the smallest infraction, individuals could find ways to resist. The resistance did not require violence or sabotage. It required intelligence, creativity, and the courage to act when action carried maximum risk. Antrim used his enemy's own defensive preparations to communicate with Allied forces. He transformed forced labor into asymmetric warfare. He saved 2,700 lives using nothing more than the spacing between ditches dug in dirt. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do us a favor, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about men who proved themselves with skill and courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Admiral Antrim's Medal of Honor was the only one awarded for actions in a POW camp during the Pacific War. His leadership saved one officer from execution in April 1942. His hidden message saved 2,700 prisoners from Allied bombing between 1943 and 1945. The Navy named a destroyer escort after him in 1943, the USS Antrim DE-31, which served throughout the Pacific Campaign. The ship was decommissioned in 1946, but Antrim's techniques influenced post-war POW training protocols. The military incorporated his methods into SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. Instructors taught that communication with friendly forces was possible even under extreme constraint. Ground signals, code patterns, anything visible from reconnaissance altitude could function as intelligence. Antrim had proven the concept worked. The Japanese commander who spared Antrim's life was never identified by name. Post-war records from the Makassar camp were incomplete. Many documents were destroyed before Allied forces arrived. The commander may have been tried for war crimes. Many camp commanders were. Or he may have died before Japan surrendered. The historical record does not say. But his decision to accept Antrim's offer to substitute himself for the beaten officer became a case study in military ethics courses. The commander faced a choice between following strict punishment protocols and recognizing genuine courage in an enemy. He chose the latter. That choice created the conditions where Antrim could later implement the trench signal. One act of mercy enabled an act of resistance. The connection was not coincidental. Antrim never sought publicity. He never wrote a memoir. He never gave interviews to television programs or documentary filmmakers. He believed his actions were simply what any officer would do in similar circumstances. But the men who survived Makassar disagreed. They testified after the war that Antrim's intervention during the beating incident gave them hope that leadership and moral courage still mattered. The Japanese had created an environment designed to strip prisoners of dignity and identity. Antrim's willingness to risk execution for another man proved that the Japanese had not succeeded. The prisoners remained soldiers. They had not been broken. The hidden message in the trenches represented a different kind of courage. The intervention during the beating was spontaneous, driven by immediate necessity. The trench signal required planning, patience, and sustained deception under close supervision. Antrim knew the Japanese guards were watching. He knew any deviation from the approved plan could result in discovery, but he also knew that Allied reconnaissance aircraft were flying over Makassar. He knew those aircraft carried cameras. He knew intelligence analysts would study the photos. He trusted that someone, somewhere, would recognize the pattern and understand its meaning. That trust was not misplaced. The October 1943 reconnaissance photos reached the right analysts. The The camp was removed from the target list. The system worked. The number of lives saved by the hidden message cannot be calculated precisely. Intelligence estimates suggested that without the warning signal, Makassar camp would have been bombed at least 3 times between October 1943 and August 1945. Standard B-24 bombing accuracy from 8,000 feet altitude was approximately 1,000 feet circular error probable. That meant half the bombs dropped would land within 1,000 feet of the aim point. The prisoner camp was located adjacent to port facilities that were legitimate military targets. Bombs intended for the port would have hit the camp. With 2,700 prisoners in an area measuring 400 by 600 meters, casualty rates would have been catastrophic. Conservative estimates suggested at least 30% casualties per bombing raid. 3 raids would have killed or wounded approximately 2,400 men. Antrim's signal prevented that outcome. The legacy is specific. Antrim demonstrated that naval officers possess skills beyond shipboard operations. Peacetime leadership translates to wartime survival. The ability to read human behavior, to negotiate under pressure, to make decisions based on incomplete information, these are universal command skills. Antrim applied them in a situation where standard military training provided no guidance. There was no regulation covering how to intervene in an execution. There was no manual explaining how to signal friendly forces using enemy construction projects. Antrim improvised. He used judgment developed through years of command experience. He took calculated risks that paid off because he understood his enemy and his own capabilities. The hidden message trick was not unique. Other POW camps in the Pacific used similar techniques. Prisoners arranged roof tiles to spell words visible from the air. Prisoners created geometric patterns in vegetable gardens. Prisoners used laundry lines to form code sequences. The techniques varied, but the principle remained constant. Communication with friendly forces was possible if prisoners were creative and careful. Antrim's contribution was demonstrating that such communication could be implemented successfully, even under close enemy supervision. The Japanese guards at Makassar watched the trench construction daily. They inspected the work multiple times, but they never detected the signal. The deception succeeded because Antrim maintained the appearance of compliance while executing his modification gradually over 2 weeks. No single day's work showed obvious deviation. The pattern only became visible when viewed as a completed whole from thousands of feet above. The military lessons extend beyond POW scenarios. Antrim's actions illustrate asymmetric tactics at their most fundamental level. When an opponent controls overwhelming force, direct resistance is futile, but indirect resistance remains possible. The key is identifying opportunities where the opponent's own actions can be exploited. The Japanese needed bomb shelters. They forced prisoners to dig trenches. Antrim recognized that trench placement could encode information. He used the enemy's defensive requirements against them. This is asymmetric thinking. This is how weaker forces survive against stronger opponents, not through confrontation, but through exploitation of systemic vulnerabilities. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure Admiral Antrim's story does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered. You're helping make that happen.